Welcome to Authors Out Loud, a series of discussions with authors exploring their books, delving into their inspirations for their characters, themes, and stories, as well as discussing the craft of writing itself, the trials and victories, their experience seeing their work to completion. I am Jean Greenlaw with my co-host, Susan Supak. Today, we are delighted to have the honor of interviewing my friend and distinguished author, Lois Lowry. Lois is the author of 52 books, 2 of which were honored with the Newbery Medal. The Newbery Medal is awarded for the most distinguished contribution to American literature for children. And Lois is one of only 6 authors to have received this award twice. To win once is a lifetime achievement. To win twice is astonishing. She has received numerous other awards, including the Margaret Edwards Award given to an author and a body of work for significant and lasting contribution to young adult literature. Her biographer has written that Lois Lowry is clearly one of the most important 20th and 21st century American writers for children. She has also been awarded several honorary degrees and was recently named by Brown University as one of their 10 coolest female Brown University alumni. She is joined in this honor by Janet Yellen, United States Secretary of the Treasury, and Emma Watson, otherwise known as Hermione or Belle. Mighty good company. Welcome, Lois.
Thank you.
You have written many books, and when asked what is your favorite, you always select Autumn Street. It contains topics that were not common in children's literature in the time that it was published. You wrote about racism, grief, fear. Let's begin with discussing that book, and after you discuss it, would you read a passage from it to us?
Okay. I have to think way back. Autumn Street was published in 1980. It was earlier than that. I gave it to the publisher at a time when it could have been published in 1979, and it would have been my 3rd book. It ended up the 4th. Reason for that is that the publisher read it and didn't quite know what to do with it. I had written 2 previous books that were called young adult books. This one, though, had the main character was a very young child. Confession, it was me. It's written in the first person. It's autobiographical. It's fictionalized autobiography. But the child, the I of the book, was only 6 years old. And yet it's not a book for 6-year-olds. And they didn't quite know how to market it. At any rate, they held on to it and dithered around, and we back and forth. It was before email, but so I guess it was mostly by phone. And in the meantime, I sat down and wrote another book and gave them that one. And they said, okay, we'll publish this one first. And that one was Anastasia Krupnik, completely unlike Autumn Street. And after they published Anastasia Krupnik, which was a lighthearted book about a 10-year-old child, then they published the more difficult Autumn Street. It has always, as you pointed out, remained my favorite. I think that's because it's me, because I'm the main character. So there's an element, my psychiatrist husband would say, an element of narcissism there, I suppose. But also the book is populated with people whom I loved. And almost all of them are gone now. I'm just remembering that my baby brother is born in the book. My brother John, who's now 80 years old, my little brother, is still around. But the others are all gone, and their memories are important to me. And so the book is important to me. And you asked me to read from it, and I knew you were going to ask me that. So I looked through. I haven't reread this book in a very long time. But I selected this one chapter, and I need a little introduction to this, I guess. I have to explain that my father was a career military officer. I was born in Honolulu. for that reason. And then when I started to say World War I. When World War II began in 1941, when I was 4 years old, my father eventually had to go overseas. He was in the Pacific during the war. And so my mother, who was expecting a third child, took her 2 little girls, I was the second, back to her home in Pennsylvania, and we moved in with my grandparents. There was plenty of room. It was a big house, and there were servants, as some people had in those days, no longer, I guess. But it was a difficult situation, I'm sure, for my mother, but certainly for me as a little girl. My grandmother did not want us there, and we were disruptive. Any rate, so there we were, and that's where the book takes place. It begins with the family moving when the father goes away to the war. I do remember that during that time, immediately after my baby brother was born, my grandfather had a stroke. And that happens in the book. And so this section here is at Christmas time. This is Christmas, and the grandfather, impaired by the stroke, is brought into the room where the family is decorating a Christmas tree. It says grandmother hovered and fluttered like a distraught sparrow until he was arranged in a chair. She tucked a plaid blanket around his thin pajamaed knees and patted him into a kind of fragile symmetry, like a bouquet of dried grass. He made a moist, clicking sound with his mouth. Why does grandfather make that sound? I whispered to Mama as she unwrapped the carved ornaments. It's his false teeth, she whispered back. So now I'm jumping ahead to the paragraph that I wanted to read, but I had to explain the clicking sound first. Mama had balanced on a chair to put the golden star in place on the top of the tree. I saw the star reflect everything. The tall bookcases filled with leather-bound volumes in orderly rows, the deep red and blue patterns of the oriental rug, the brightly colored packages heaped on the floor, and my sister, her blonde hair shining, and the plaid cocoon that held the pale, fluttery moths of my grandfather's hands. Click, click. I sank again to the floor beside him, happy and safe, and made the same sound with my own tongue against my teeth. His head bobbed in a benedictory gesture. His teeth clicked. I smiled at him, rubbed my cheek against his fingers, and tried to echo the small noise. Click, click. We looked at the star, the tree, the comforting room filled with Christmas, and we made the sound to each other, a tiny staccato duet, as if we were traveling together on tiptoe to places where neither of us had yet been. I guess I chose that passage instead of many others that I have loved in that book and that are so important parts of my memory. Because I love that phrase. It seems to me to represent so much, traveling together on tiptoe to places where neither of us had yet been. It seems to me to be the phrase that describes a book, an author and a reader traveling together to places where they have never yet been. And so that's why I chose it. And that's from Autumn Street. There have been many different covers on this book. This is a paperback edition that I have here because I'm in my summer home. And the original hardcover is in a different house.
That's an excellent selection. I love that. I love your sentence there. It's so powerful, and it's a powerful book, an excellent book. When and where in your life did you think about writing? When did you become aware of what a book could be and a book could do? And was being read to a catalyst for that, or did you come about that on your own through a love of reading?
Well, I think, as many children are, I was very fortunate to live in a house. I mean, I'm looking at you and Jean and me, all of us sitting with bookcases behind us. I have always lived in houses filled with books, and I was born into a house filled with books. my mother had been a kindergarten teacher before she married. And my grandfather's house, where I spent such an important chunk of my childhood, was again a book-filled house. So I had a mother who read to me, a grandfather who read to me. Oh gosh, I could tell you so many stories. But I also had a sister who was 3 years older, my sister Helen, who began first grade when I was 3 years old, and who came home every day, or it seems in my memory to have been every day, and said, let's play school. I'll be the teacher. And she taught me to read. But what she used were the books that were so familiar to me because my mother had read them to me 100 times. So I knew the story. My sister explained to me how letters had sounds and they went together to make words. And I remembered the words in the story. And next thing I knew, I could read the stories that I'd heard my mother read so often. I don't recall when it was that I'm just remembering a section in this same book in Autumn Street where I'm taken to first grade by my sister the first day of school. And the teacher says, would you like to sit here in this desk and read a book while I greet the other children? And I looked around in the room. The first grade room was filled with books. I don't remember, however, the moment or the point in time when I realized the books were written by people, by human beings. Teachers in those days, I don't recall, paid as much attention to as they do now when they explain to the children, this is the name of the author of this book. And so I wasn't aware of that until now. I'm remembering something. I encountered a book by, you ladies will remember this name, Lois Lowry. And she had written a book. It was not her most famous. She won the Newbery Medal for a book called Strawberry Girl. But the book I remember was called Indian Captive. And it was based on a true story of a little blonde girl who was captured in upstate New York by an Indian tribe. And they took her to, I think it was Kentucky or Tennessee, walked all that way over many days. And she looked like me. The book had illustrations, and she had my light blonde hair. And the Indians, the tribe with whom she lived her entire life until she was an adult, called her corn tassel because her hair reminded them of the corn silk at the end of a stalk of corn. And I can remember secretly calling myself corn tassel because I looked like that little girl. But I also suddenly became aware that the author had my name, and I felt a great bond with that author. And every now and then now, still, I get an email from some child who says, I love your book, Strawberry Girl. And I have to write back and say, I'm so sorry. I wish I had written that, but that was actually written by Lois Lowry, who is no longer living. So I suppose that being aware of that author with my name gave me a sense of kinship and a feeling of wanting to write a book.
It is incredible how long those kind of influences stay with us and those memories and how they affect the way that we think and the way we write and the things that we do later on. It's really amazing. You mentioned being the daughter of an armed forces officer, and you traveled around a great deal. I was a Army daughter myself, and I know what that's like. And you lived in a lot of different places for short periods of time. And I've heard you mention that that did have an effect on some of the things that you have written. If you'd like to share about that. I know your first book was A Summer to Die. And if you'd like to mention what effect that had too, what led you to write that book.
Now, that's a question that encompasses a lot of stuff and a lot of time and a lot of.
You can break it down whatever way you want.
Yeah. I'm going to back up a minute to segue into your question, because something I should have mentioned in talking about early books and my awareness of early books and authors, I should have mentioned my mother reading to me after I was 8 years old. So I obviously was already reading a lot to myself, but mother still read to us. And my sister and I had separate bedrooms. My sister would have been 11. Okay. And I'm in my bed. Helen's in her bedroom, and mother is in the hall with the hall light coming down. She's reading, and the book she chose to read was an adult book, and it was called The Yearling. My sister, who was just inching her way into adolescence, after a couple of chapters said, "That is so boring." And so she closed her door, and mother read it just to me. And it was a long adult book. And it changed my literate life, because it was the first book I read where everything wasn't perfect and wonderful, or Winnie the Pooh, magical. But this was a book about people who suffered and whose lives were hard, and you cared about them. And more than that, like the Lois Lowry book, our copy of The Yearling had wonderful illustrations by N.C. Wyeth. And the little boy, the character in the book, Jody, the main character, was my age. And he too looked like me. He was skinny and blonde. And I became him in that book. Okay, so with that as background and mentioning my sister, of course, as sisters are, siblings are, was a very important part of my entire childhood. She was the closest friend I had because she was within my family. And when we moved, she went along. And then I'm trying to connect this to A Summer to Die, which is my first book, written many, many years later. But when I was, oh gosh, I have so much time to cover here. I got married when I was 19. Okay, dumb thing to do, but that's what people did then. Had a baby when I was 21, had a baby when I was 22, had a baby when I was 24, had a baby when I was 25. Okay, and now I'm 25 years old, and I have a brand new baby, born November of 1962, my son Ben. And when he is still an infant, a newborn infant, I got a telegram from my parents telling me that my sister had died. My oldest child was 4.5 years old, little girl. And I tried to tell her the story of my sister and me, as one does. You know, when something happens like that, you tell it to yourself over and over again, trying to sort it out, make sense of something that makes no sense. My sister was only 28 when she died. And my little girl would listen because mommy was telling her a story, but it wasn't the story that she wanted to hear. And so she would wrestle herself off my lap and go to play. And I continued telling that story to myself for a long time. Then I went back to college when my youngest child started kindergarten. Now I went to graduate school. And finally, I had an education, and my children were less needy of my time. And I wrote my first book, and I was 40 years old, but that's the book I wrote, the story of, I think I have a copy of it here. Yeah, this is one of many different covers that it has on it. But it was the story of the two sisters. I changed their age. In the book, they're 13 and 15. But it's the younger girl dealing with the loss of her older sister and the differences between them. And I began the book with an incident right out of our own childhoods when on the very first page, I've named the girls Meg and Molly. The older girl takes a piece of chalk. They share a bedroom, as occasionally my sister and I did in some of the houses we lived in. And the older sister takes a piece of chalk and draws a line across the rug and up the wall, and then says to the younger sister, "There, now you can be as much of a slob as you want to, but keep your stuff on your side of the room. This side is mine." My sister was the tidy one, the neat, orderly one, and I was the slob. And that she actually drew a line dividing our bedroom at one point. And so this was the other autobiographical book that I wrote in addition to Autumn Street.
You mentioned a little bit earlier the Anastasia Krupnik books, and in them you do deal with serious themes, but you do it within a very humorous context. And this series contains 9 books, and they're interlaced with 4 books about her younger brother, Sam. And you mentioned that this series was kind of precipitated by President Jimmy Carter's daughter, Amy. How did that occur?
Okay, I wrote that book in 1979, the first Anastasia book. I mentioned that I wrote it because the publisher didn't know what to do with Autumn Street, and I just wanted something lighter hearted. And I was fascinated by Amy Carter, who was 10 years old at that time. And because she was the president's daughter, she appeared now and then on television or in newspaper articles. And I had a particular fascination with presidential daughters because my father, I mentioned that he was a military officer, but I didn't mention that he was an oral surgeon. And when I was in college, my father was transferred to Walter Reed Hospital. He was on the staff there. He was in charge of that department at Walter Reed. And because of that, among his patients were, at that time, the vice president's daughters, Tricia and Julie Nixon. Okay, I never met them, but they were the ages approximately of my sister and myself. Dad would come home and said Tricia and Julie had been in for an appointment. And he talked about how well-mannered they were and how polite. And because he was checking their teeth, he also felt it necessary to mention that they flossed their teeth regularly. So my sister and I took an immediate dislike to the vice president's daughters, whom we had never and still have never met. And then I continued my fascination with presidential daughters, still never meeting any of them. And then by 1979, Jimmy Carter was president. His daughter, Amy, was 10 years old. And she was not polite and neat and tidy and probably didn't floss her teeth either. She behaved badly in public. And I remember one time someone thrust a microphone in front of her 10-year-old mouth and said, "Do you have anything you want to say to the children of the United States?" And she said, "No." And I thought, good for her. So when I sat down to write that book and I introduced Anastasia on the first page, I described her as looking like Amy Carter. She had glasses and she had hair that I described as the color of squash, kind of reddish blonde hair. Later illustrators gave her dark hair on book covers because they hadn't read that section. Now, I have never met Amy Carter either. And she did, however, go to the same college I did, Brown University. And guess what? She behaved badly there and she got kicked out. So I have a very soft spot for her. And I don't know if she realizes that Anastasia was based on her for 9 books.
Wonderful.
Oh, I hope she listens to this. That would be would be a great message to send her. That's wonderful.
I'm sure you receive many letters from readers. Could you share a few of them with us?
Yeah, you told me you were going to ask me that.
I did.
So I went and printed. I went to look for some to print out. You know, a lot of my, of course, a lot of my correspondence with readers now, young readers, comes in the form of, and I don't have those emails, but I can quote some of my favorites. One is, "Please tell me all the similes and metaphors in this book. I need this information by Thursday." So I have a form reply that explains why I can't do their homework and why they would benefit from doing their own homework. There's one that says, "Please answer this question for me. Do you consider yourself to be a prominent 19th century author?" Anyway, of course, the ones I remember are all the crazy ones. but I did, from back in the day when I used to get actual mail, I went into my computer and I printed out a few. And interestingly, the ones that I find now most fascinating tend to be from adults. One, I'd forgotten. Well, okay, I'm going to start with this one. Ms. Lowry. I think actually this was an email that I printed out. I am aware that the likelihood of you actually reading this is very close to zero. That's not true. I read them all, but I shall send it anyway. In the year 2000, our son was 11 years old and in the 5th grade. The teacher assigned The Giver as reading material based on your Newbery Award. Our son wasn't very far into the book when he closed it, put it down on his school desk, and refused to complete the assignment. He made us very proud of him that day. At 11 years old, he knew what was right and what was very wrong. Your story is a sickening and twisted tale, obviously derived by someone with very deep issues. To say that this book is suitable for your readers is an offense against children. I have perused your website and have concluded that, based on several of your book topics, you must be somewhat disturbed. We will be vigilant in watching for assignments that may include reading any of your books. I hope you get some help.
Oh, dear.
Okay, so that one is in response to The Giver. And interestingly, I can't read all of this. It's quite long and it has almost no punctuation. So I have to pull out and sort out and edit as I go along. But this is also in response to The Giver. And this is from a 16-year-old boy. He says, I'm 16. I'm not so great at grammar. True. So excuse me. I have read The Giver in school, and I just recently bought all the books, and I have devoured The Giver again in just hours. I'm jumping over some, but something major about me is I am gay, and I haven't come out for fear of really everything. My dad's a pastor, and I live in the South, so I think you get the picture. My parents want me to be something I don't want to be. They want the sameness of them. They want me to be religious, go to church, make good grades, be a doctor. They want me to be a normal human being who follows the rules, buys a house, marries a girl, has kids, gets a job, grows old, and dies. That is not what I want. And he goes on. And he says, at times I'm confused. It gets me down a lot. And most of the time I sleep the pain away. And he goes on to say that this book has made him feel, because it's about a boy who rejects the sameness of his world and moves out of it in order to seek a more honest life. And that's the kind of letter that I treasure. I did, of course, write back to him, and I heard from him one more time. And there's no date on that. It's probably 12 years ago. And I often wonder about that boy still, what happened to him. But I also hope that because he found a book, and one hopes other books that spoke to him, that he was able to make his way through what was sounding like a very tough life. Here's one, and then we don't have time to go on with too many of them, but here I'll even tell you this name. This is from a 32-year-old man whose name is Yuri Konovalenko, and he's writing from Moscow. My books, as you know, are published in many different languages, and I had forgotten that The Giver is in Russian. But he says, I'm writing to you to express my deepest gratitude for your art. For The Giver series is utterly art. I am a 32 years old man. I have a family, a beloved wife, an amazing son, and a loyal dog. I love the dog. I have read quite a number of books throughout my life. The Giver books made me cry through all the story. I don't know why I took it so personally, but I was so worried about the baby's destiny. I thought that it was impossible for any book to touch something so deep inside me. When my son grows up, I'll recommend him to read the books and discuss them with him after that. I want to thank you again. I send the warmest greetings from Moscow. Again, there's no date on this. It's some years back. And of course, Russia is now a very problematic, I'll never know what happened to that man or to his son, but isn't it interesting and gratifying to hear that from such a distance in every way, not just geographical, that he has found something to cling to in one of my books. Let me just tell you one more thing. During the pandemic, when we were also isolated, and every school teacher in the country emailed me to see if I would Zoom with their classroom, and I just couldn't do it. But I did Zoom with classrooms in other countries, and some of them were amazing. Romania, one in Iran, if you can imagine that, Kathmandu, Nepal, Korea, just every place. And what was interesting, most of them were high school students. Most of them were reading The Giver. That's the book that's published in the most languages, and also Number the Stars. And all of them, these students, these teenagers in other countries, and of course, we could only do it in places where they could speak and understand English, would ask me how the community of Jonas, this futuristic place where he lives, how it had become that way. And that's what we talked about. And I think most of them left with an appreciation through the book and our discussion of how important are the choices we make and the compromises we make. And the fact that the teenagers I was talking to, were going to be the ones in the future who would determine what their community, what their government would be like. And I came away from each of those meetings feeling, even in these dark times, feeling optimistic about young people and their hopes for the future. And they were so much alike in this wide variety of countries. They all hoped for the same things.
That's wonderful to hear. I'm so glad to hear that. Your first Newbery Medal was awarded in 1990 for the book you mentioned, Number the Stars. Incredible story of a young girl whose Jewish friend was forced out of her home in Denmark during World War II. And the school library journal wrote, and I quote, "Readers are taken to the very heart of Anne-Marie's experience, and through their eyes come to understand the true meaning of bravery." Now, from that quote, from your books and from the letters that you've read, it's obvious that you have a gift for effectively taking themes and ideas that are important to people of all ages, young, old, growing up, having to live in the world, and putting them inside compelling stories. In your Newbery Medal acceptance speech, you mentioned that as a writer, you only cover the small and the ordinary. I love that. And you gave an example of the shiny boots on the Nazi soldiers. Would you elaborate on that?
Well, I think what I think this is true probably for all of us. We come away from a book that we've read or loved, and what we remember and what seems important to our memory are these details. That's what makes it come alive. And as you were talking about Number the Stars, I remembered something. A teacher, she still sends me a birthday card every year, but this was some years ago. She's long retired from teaching in Johnson City, Tennessee. She wrote to me that she had a 4th grade class and she was reading Number the Stars to them. And well, she told me a lot about what transpired in the class, and I don't have time to go into all of it, but the detail that I wanted to mention that brought this to mind is that she said in this 4th grade class in Tennessee, she herself was not Jewish, but she went to a jewelry store and she bought a necklace like the necklace on the cover of the book, the Star of David necklace, which figures in the plot of the book. And she wore it when she read the last chapter to the children. And she said they noticed it right away. And so she took it off and she gave it to them, and they passed it around the classroom as she read the final chapter. And she said she'd watched as each of the children took the necklace and pressed the Star of David into the palm of her hand and left an impression there. And she said to me in her letter, and I think it is true, that none of those children are ever going to forget that. And it wasn't the overall story of the book. It was the details, the Star of David. And incidentally, I took the photograph of the girl on the cover, but it was the book designer who thought of putting the necklace on the cover and did it so beautifully. But I guess what I'm trying to say is it's the little details that I try to incorporate into stories, because those are the things that make it come alive, that make us able to see the story in our mind. And I've thought of one other story I'm going to tell you. This dates way back to A Summer to Die and the Anastasia books, but a child wrote to me back, these are letter writing days before email, terrible handwriting, and said she had just read A Summer to Die. I think she was 10, 11 years old. She'd lived in Denver, and she had just read A Summer to Die. And she said, I could just see everything that happened in the book. She said, I could just see them walking in the meadow. How did you make me? I want to be a writer. How did you make me able to see that? And I wrote back and said, a writer isn't taking a photograph. I can't tell you every blade of grass in that meadow or every flower blossom. So I choose the details that I think will go into your imagination, and you can see it in your mind. And you don't see the same thing I do, but I've tried to create a picture that you can see as you read the book. And she wrote back, and she said she just read the second Anastasia book, in which Anastasia's brother Sam is 2 years old. And she said, I could just see Sam walking down the hall of their apartment with his bottom was fat because he still wore diapers. And there was a stain on the wallpaper because you described that. And she said, I could just see that hallway and I could see Sam. And she said, I'm going to enter a writing contest for children. And then I heard from her a third and last time. And she didn't even write a letter. She sent me a page of the Denver Post. And there was a picture of a little girl with a big smile. And she had written in her terrible handwriting on the top, I did it, I won. And the headline, the caption of the picture was, Blind Child Wins Writing Award.
Oh,
Yes. Oof. So because she had a distinctive name, not long ago, I thought of that child. And I Googled the name and I found she is now a lawyer. That has nothing to do with me, but it just, she was an accomplished child to begin with. But I thought of that story because I was attempting to answer your question about details, the shiny boots. And incidentally, I know we don't have a lot of time, but another story about those shiny boots. I was in Australia on a book tour before Number of the Stars came out, but it had been written. And I was having lunch in some city in Australia with several librarians. And I described the book, Number of the Stars, which was about to be published. And as I was talking about it, I noticed that a woman having lunch was wearing a necklace with a Star of David. And I had just seen the design for the book cover, and I told her about it. And she told me the story of her necklace. She said, I wear it in memory of my mother. She said, I was born in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. My mother was Jewish. My father was not, but we were in danger. And my parents created a hiding place in our apartment under the floor. And she said, I was just 3 years old. And she said, the time came when the knock on the door came and they lifted me into the hiding place, and I peeked out and I saw the high, shiny boots, and I saw them take my parents away. So anyway, that's another oof moment. But that's the boots in the book is something that you mentioned as a detail. Maybe I had mentioned them in my speech. And maybe I haven't reread those speeches. Maybe I mentioned that woman in the speech. But at any rate, it's the details that make a story come to life, I think.
You need to go back and reread the speeches. They are magnificent. You have received the second Newbery Medal in 1994 for The Giver. Would you show us the medals, by the way, so everyone can see what a Newbery Medal looks like?
But do you know the history of these particular medals? In 2013, I sold my house. I had been widowed and I sold my house and I moved to a smaller place near my children. And where I met Howard, who's in the other room right now. But anyway, I hired a woman to help me take my large house apart, filled with stuff. And, I had to downsize and get rid of stuff. And so I had a wall in that house of shelves that I used to call my wall of perpetual self-adoration. and it was filled with awards and the Newbery medals. And they were packed in a box. And somehow when this woman hired someone to come and collect the things that were packed to be taken to the dump, they took the box with the medals and the awards, and they all disappeared forever. Now, that broke my heart for a brief while until I thought, those were just things. And after a while, it didn't matter a whole lot. But somebody who felt very sorry for me contacted the American Library Association, and they made 2 new medals for me. So I do have these. And they are much too heavy to be worn as earrings, even though it's tempting. But here's what they look like. Wait a minute. And see, I haven't looked at these in the same way. I haven't reread the speeches, but they do have for the most distinguished contribution, American Literature for Children. Then it has my name and the date, and then of course my name and a different date on the second one. And they're very heavy. When Number the Stars won, I hadn't been thinking about it. I just wasn't even aware of the Newbery Medal. And so it was a complete surprise. And then 4 years later, people like Jean Greenlaw were apparently saying The Giver was going to win. And so I kept hearing that from other people, and I did not want to be sitting by my phone. And then I knew what date the committee was meeting. I didn't want to be thinking about it. And my husband had just retired and we had planned to take a trip. So we went to Antarctica during the period of time that meeting was taking place, so that I wouldn't have to even think about it. And I was on the ship in Antarctica when a little pink slip of paper was thrust under my stateroom door from the radio room. And there was a radiogram saying The Giver has just been awarded the Newbery Medal. So I stuck that in my pocket and went to lunch on this ship. And I was seated next to a woman I didn't know. But I said, I got to tell somebody about this, and I can't call my kids. And so I showed her this piece of paper. And I said, this won't mean anything to you, but this was very important. And she read it and she said, I'm the former president of the American Library Association. Of course I know what this means.
We are all connected, right?
Yeah.
In The Giver, it's a dystopian novel. And in your acceptance speech, we're going back to these wonderful acceptance speeches, you create a metaphor to explain where your idea for this book originated. You talk about the fact like a river begins with a very small stream or spring, and as it goes down, it gains more and more power.
And I'm fourth grade geography, tributaries.
Yeah, tributaries. It gains more and more power.
Yeah.
And you said like a river, you discovered this concept of elsewhere and mentioned several incidents in your life that made you aware of elsewhere. And over time, everything in you became so turbulent, you had to write this book. And I reread it just the other day, and it reminded me of how absolutely gut-wrenching this book is. You created a world without color, without music, without love, where folks could release people, in other words, kill them, if they no longer had any use or were disruptive. And would you talk about this concept of elsewhere and how you then came about writing this absolutely astonishing book?
Well, as I've just told you, I haven't reread the Newbery speeches, but I am remembering some of that metaphor, and I'm guessing that this is in the speech. The fact that when we arrived in Japan to live in Tokyo when I was 11 years old, my father had been on the island in the Pacific where the atomic bomb was loaded onto the plane that flew it to Hiroshima. And my father then entered Japan with the occupation forces, and he was setting up, he was in Tokyo eventually, setting up services for the occupation at the Tokyo hospital. And then eventually we were able to go and join him there. And when we arrived by ship, very long trip, because we sailed from New York down through Panama and then up to San Francisco and across the Pacific to Yokohama. He met us at the ship, and on our way, as he drove us to our new home in Tokyo, he whispered to me, I was 11 years old. He said, I have a surprise for you. And the surprise was a bicycle, a green bicycle. And that gave me an immense amount of freedom. That bike, I treasure the memory of that bicycle. I'm just now wondering, wonder what happened to it when we left Japan. Anyhow, it went to someone else, I hope. But he took us to live in our new home, which was in a complex that had been hastily built in Tokyo for the newly arriving Americans, the conquerors, who were now going to occupy this country. And so there were American-style houses. We moved into one, and this compound was surrounded by a wall. And I went to school every day by a bus that went through the gate and took my school was in Tokyo, in the city. But I mean, the gate to the compound wasn't locked, and I was able to ride my bicycle out of that Americanized place into the throbbing, noisy, wonderful streets of a major city, which was in ruins because of the war. And I rode my bike around. I've always been an observer. I've always been an introvert, but a keen observer. And that's what I did in those streets of the area called Shibuya. And if you go to Shibuya in Tokyo now, it's nightlife and bright lights. And I've been there, and I've been sorry to go back to ruin my memories of the time that I lived there as a child. But I used to ride my bike past a Japanese school, and I would stop there and watch the children in their uniforms playing on the playground. I've written about this in a different book, but we never talked to each other, even though I was learning to speak a little Japanese, and presumably they were studying English, I don't know. But we stared at each other, and we were scared of each other. We were they would have called me gaijin, a foreigner, scary foreigner. At any rate, it wasn't until many, many years later, 1994, when the giver won the Newbery Medal, which was given in that year in Miami. And I went to Miami for that event, and I had breakfast with the man who was receiving the Caldecott Medal for a wonderful book called Grandfather's Journey. And that was Alan Say, whom I heard from just recently, because his birthday, he's born the same year I was, and his birthday is August, so I always send him a birthday email. And at any rate, so Alan and I had breakfast together, and he gave me a copy of Grandfather's Journey, and he drew a little picture in it and signed his name, and I gave him a copy of The Giver, and I signed my name in Japanese. Alan is Japanese, and he looked at that in some astonishment, and then he said, how is it you're able to do that? And I said, well, I lived in Japan when I was a child. Where did you live? He said, that's where I lived. At any rate, suddenly he said to me, were you the girl on the green bicycle? And that was so astonishing. And we've been good friends ever since. But we had missed out on many years of friendship because of this uncertainty, this disparity between our cultures, and the fact that for me, he was part of elsewhere, and it took me a long time to get there. I've forgotten now what your question was.
Doesn't matter
your
because the
concept-
answer was great.
Exactly. How the concept of elsewhere drove you, literally drove you to write the gift.
Can I add one more?
Absolutely. Do not worry about the time.
Okay, because you can edit most of what I'm saying, get rid of it. But
No way.
many years after that, my parents were both very old and they were in a nursing facility. My mother was on oxygen and she was blind and she needed full-time nursing care. My father was in the, what do you call it, assisted living wing of the same facility. And it was in Virginia. I lived in Boston. I would fly down every 6 weeks to visit them. And one time I visited Mother first, and her mind was intact. And we often would talk about Helen, my sister, her first child, and Helen's death. And then I went, when she tired, I went to see my dad, and my brother and I had prepared a photograph album. And turning the pages, he would remember there would be a house we lived in, a car. He was a car guy. There was a car he loved, Chrysler 300. He bought it in 1954. At any rate, there was a picture of the two little girls. And he said, oh, there you are with your sister. And then he said, I can't remember her name. And I told him her name. I said, she was named for her grandmother. Her name was Helen. And he said, whatever happened to her? And I had to say, she died, Dad. And he had forgotten that. And when I was driving my rental car back to the airport that day, I started thinking, what if, and when a writer starts thinking, what if, a story will always begin to take shape. I started, what if there were a way that we could manipulate the human brain and get rid of all memories that make us sad or scared? Dad immediately forgot. By 5 minutes later, he didn't remember the death of his daughter, but there was that moment when he did, and it made him so upset. But then I began to think, no, that wouldn't be a good idea. And by the time I got back to Boston, I had decided to write a book that would incorporate that concept and the manipulation of memory. Of course, the book turned out to be much more than that. I later did another book that dealt with memory, a book called Gossamer that I've always been very fond of, but it deals with the same concept. Memory and dreams are things that I've always been fascinated by. Two things that are so unique to us. There's a line in the book Autumn Street where the sisters are, the little girl and her older sister, in bed, in twin beds in our grandfather's house, and they're talking, and suddenly the older sister doesn't reply, and the little girl telling the story sits, and I realized her dreams would always be different from mine. And that's true. And not only your dreams, but your memories are always different. But at any rate, dreams and memories are two fascinating concepts. Even though I've dealt with those things in several books, I feel as though I could deal with them again and again. They're unending fascination for me.
Once you've received a Newbery Medal, it's always with you, in the sense of any book that's published, it will say Newbery Medal winner. In any articles, or when I introduced you, it's mentioned. What effect does this have on you? And is it a blessing or a curse?
You know, I haven't found it to be either, really. It's not something I think about much. I guess I don't have a better answer than that. It's except that this. I've forgotten how many people are on the Newbery committee, but they're highly qualified people. Maybe you've been on the committee. I don't know.
I have been, yes.
Okay. And so how many people are there? 12, 15?
There are 20.
Oh, okay. So it's 20 carefully selected people, very knowledgeable, and on a particular day in a particular year, they choose a book. A week later, they might have chosen a different book. Then a month later, they may hate the book they chose a month ago. So it seems to me to be, it's important in one way, but it's not important in another, because it could have been any one of many wonderful books that are published every year. I'd hate to be the one having to make that choice. And also, I think probably you would know better than I, having been on the committee, it's probably often a compromise.
It is a very fraught discussion, I will say that,
Oh,
because people come in having fallen in love with a particular book, and
Yeah.
they're going to fight to the very end
Yeah.
for that book. We try to be open-minded and listen to each other, which we are,
Yeah.
but you know, it is fraught. And that's where the Newbery honor books come in, that those ones that come down to the very end, the honor awards are also given, so that you're saying there isn't just one really great book. There's one that's better than any other one this year, but here are some other really terrific books.
Yeah. So I guess it's something that I don't give any thought to, but I'm reminded of it every time I publish a new book, because you're right, there it says Newbery Award author or something. It's always there on the book cover. So it is important in that way, but I don't give it any thought. So I guess not that this is conscious on my part, but I try to write different kinds of books. So I'm never going to try to do another book like The Giver, because I already did that. I don't want to do that again. So I'll do a different kind of book.
You have such an incredible perspective on life. I cannot wait to hear how you answer this question. I was surprised to find out when I was doing research for our conversation today that The Giver is consistently in the top 10 on list of banned books, which surprised me. Why do you think that is?
I have never figured that out. I will say it's no longer in the top 10. For a number of years after its publication, it was, and almost immediately after its publication. And it will not be a surprise to you to hear that what often happens is people taking things out of context. In the case of The Giver, they have taken two things that they seize upon, and I'm doing this because I picture them going to a school board meeting, holding up the book, and they've selected a scene in which the boy, 12 years old, the children in this community are assigned at the age of 12 to volunteer work. They have to do various volunteer jobs, and his job during the period in the book is working at the what they call the House of the Old, where elderly people are taken and where they live and are taken care of. And so there's a scene in which he is bathing an elderly woman. He's sitting beside the tub. He has a sponge, I think, and they're talking, and the conversation is meaningful. But he also is sponging her back, I think. Okay, so immediately the boy with naked woman. And the scene has no sexual context whatsoever. The other scene, of course, that they choose is the scene where he sees his father kill an infant. But again, it's taken out of context. You have to read it with the whole surrounding information. So I think what happens is, or what has happened in the past, is that the book made people uncomfortable, and they weren't exactly certain why. And so they selected those two places in the book. But I think what makes them uncomfortable on some level that they don't identify is the fact that a boy, a child, perceives the hypocrisy of the adult generation and fights against it. And I think that strikes an uncomfortable note for some adults. However, as I pointed out, it's no longer, I mean, it's still banned. It's banned in Florida. It's not in classrooms in Florida anymore, and probably not in Texas. But here's an interesting thing that happened recently in your state, and you probably know this because that's where you live and where you are. I've forgotten what town or city it was in, what school district, but a directive was given that no book could be used without a book giving the opposite point of view also being used in a classroom. And at this meeting where this directive was made known to this meeting of teachers, someone had a recording machine and recorded the voice of a teacher saying, "But I teach Number the Stars. How can there be an opposing point of view?" At any rate, that made the news. And so I had to be a talking head on CNN briefly. And that directive was rescinded because it was so foolhardy. I was just going to tell you, I'll just tell you one funny story, because since I mentioned the boy with the naked lady in the bathtub, I was invited by the filmmakers when they were filming the movie of The Giver in South Africa. They let me go over there for a week to watch the making of the film. And they happened to be making the scene where the Council of Elders are seated on the stage and the auditorium is filled with the citizens, and it's this annual ceremony. And while I was there, Jeff Bridges said to me, "Would you like to be one of the elders and playing this role?" And I said, frankly, it looked very boring. They were just sitting there for hour after hour. So I said, they left out the scene with the boy in the bathtub, and so that it didn't become a controversy. But Jeff Bridges later, I heard him in an interview, I think it was on the Charlie Rose show. He said, no, Lois didn't want to be one of the elders. He said she wanted to be the old lady in the bathtub, but we left that scene out. Not true. I didn't volunteer for that.
That's good. Well, during the COVID shutdown, you wrote and released a memoir of your youth in Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima, and called On the Horizon, World War II Reflections. And it's the only book, as I understand, that you have written in verse. And we were emailing back and forth, and you mentioned a letter that you received from a young girl in Tokyo, and you went back to that beautiful phrase that you read to us from earlier, that you felt that you and she
and I were tiptoeing together to places where neither of us had yet been. The child was 10, as I recall, and she lived, an American child, but lived in Tokyo. And she wrote to me to say that I go to the same school that you went to. And so we had this little correspondence, but she had just read that book, On the Horizon. And I loved a phrase that she used in her letter. She said, "It gave me feelings of sadness." And what better thing can a book do than to give a child feelings of sadness or joy or exhilaration or whatever feelings consist of, for a book to produce them. But here's something I haven't told you because it's more recently. She wrote me again to say that she had been particularly affected by a page in the book that describes a little boy on his tricycle who died when the bomb went off over Hiroshima. The little boy's name was Shinichi. I'm going to forget his last name. Doesn't matter. But this little girl who wrote to me was particularly saddened by that scene. It gave me feelings of sadness, she said. And then she wrote to me again. Her first name is Verity, Verity. She said, "I had my mother look up what Shinichi, the Japanese boy's name, what that meant. And it meant truth. And she said, that's the same thing my name means." And so when I replied to her, I pointed out how we're all connected to each other in so many different ways. And she had just found that one very special connection with that child who died in 1945.
That's amazing. Love that.
your latest book, The Windaby Puzzle, it's definitely very unique in structure and content. In 1952, you present the science, the history. In 1952, a body was found in a peat bog, in, I believe, in Germany, and it was believed to be that of a girl from the Iron Age. And so you wrote a story about that girl to bring her to life. Then science progresses and they find out, oops, no, it's really the body of a boy. So you write another story and you create a story of a boy who is actually a character in the girl's story. And then you know, so that you give us a really unique structure along with two stories. How long was this journey of this science going by? When did you put it all together?
Well, my recollection is the pandemic sort of began in the spring of 2020. And I can date that because I had accepted an invitation to go and speak at Oxford in England on March 6th of 2020. And off I went, paying no attention to the news. I was curious when I got on my plane in Boston to fly to London, why nobody else was on the plane, just a very few people. Oops, I just hadn't been paying attention. So I went, I did the thing at Oxford, and in the hotel, there was a poster for this lecture series. And there's my picture and my name. And above me are the people who preceded me, and after me are the people who are going to come next, one of whom was Thomas Friedman of the New York Times. And all of them had stamped over their information, canceled, canceled. And then there's me. And then below me, canceled, canceled, because everybody else was smarter than me. But at any rate, I got back home. It's March. And then it really closed down. And in fact, my husband was taken off to the hospital in an ambulance on April 6th. And he was in the hospital for 86 days. And I was I had several neighbors who died. And there I was, and my library was my public library was closed. But I was there alone at home, and I was reading something. I don't remember what I read, but I read about this body found in northern Germany, a bog body, as they're called, that was originally thought to be a 13-year-old girl. And that makes a light bulb go off over my head. 13-year-old girl, those are my people. And so I started thinking a lot about that and began to create a story about that girl. And of course, I had to do a lot of research. The body was carbon dated to the 1st century. And so I had to find out what life was like in the 1st century, and my library was closed. And I discovered all sorts of things. For one thing, you can go on your computer to the London Museum, the British Museum, and you can go into an actual room and look at artifacts on your computer. And I did that. The best resource I found was a book written originally in Latin by Tacitus, a Roman historian who had visited northern Germany and wrote about those tribes in that time, in the 1st century. So I compiled all that research while writing the story. And it took a while to do all of that. But it gave me something to think about outside of, should I wash all my groceries after they're delivered? You know, all those things we were doing at that time. I was very happy to find, I think I have a copy of it here. I can hold it up. Yeah, it was the publisher's decision, because I remember thinking, gee, when I write about seeing the picture of this body, everybody reading it is going to wish to see the body. And the publisher decided to put this on the, what do they call this? The
End pages.
Thank you. So that everybody who's curious about that body can look at it there. It was a fascinating project.
Perfect book. Now you have a new book on the horizon due in the spring of 2024, don't you?
No. On the horizon was the one about Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima. The new book has a very odd title, which I can explain to you. And it's called It's 3 nouns: tree, table, book. And I believe I've seen a copy of the cover. I believe it has a period after each of those words. And here is the origin of that. Now, you guys are not as old as me, so you might not know this, but when you're my age and you go to the doctor and they're trying to test your cognition, they tell you 3 words and they say, remember these words, and we're going to ask you a little later to repeat them. And that tests how good or bad your memory is. And so this book, the main character is an 11-year-old girl, and her next door neighbor is her best friend, and her next door neighbor is, I think, 89, and is beginning to teeter in her cognition. So this child has access to, I can almost see one in my bookcase across the room, the Merck manual, because her neighbor across the street is the son of a doctor, and the doctor gives her an old Merck manual, and she reads about how to do these tests, and she attempts to teach her friend, the next door neighbor, how to pass these tests, because for obvious reasons. And she instructs the neighbor after she flunks the 3-word test several times. When the little girl's giving her the test, she tells her this, and this is the way I've learned to deal with that particular test. If you form a mental picture of the words, for me at least, it's easier to remember them. So the little girl tells her neighbor, I'm going to tell you 3 words, and I want you to try to think of a little story about each word. And so the neighbor does that. And she tells the stories of a tree, a table, and a book from her own childhood. And it reveals to the child a tragic childhood that she had not known of, because this woman has been an immigrant from Poland, and she had fled Poland when she was a little girl, as the Nazis occupied it. So it's a book about generations and their connection to each other and their connection to history, and the importance of passing the history along. I guess I won't tell you too many more details about the book, but that essentially is the story. And interestingly, the publisher gave the manuscript, as they always do, to an illustrator to make a jacket, and they gave it to an Israeli illustrator. And so it's an interesting jacket.
You have artifacts in your home that are symbolic of several of your books. Could you tell us about some of those artifacts and what they mean to you?
Yeah, there are 2 things here in this house. As I mentioned, this house was built in 1769. And so there are a number of things in this house that I've picked up at antique barns full of antiques, which one finds in Maine. And one of these things I actually found when I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There was a Danish antique shop in it was actually in Boston. And when I was in there just roaming around one time, I happened on a blue trunk, an old blue trunk. And I don't remember what year this would have been, but it was long after I'd written Number of the Stars. But Number of the Stars has a blue trunk in the book. We were talking earlier about details. And in that blue trunk, which is itself a detail that the child reading the book can see, there is also a folded yellow dress, which is part of the plot as well. At any rate, I saw this blue trunk, and the book had long ago been published, but I couldn't not buy that. And it's ended up here in this old farmhouse in Maine. The other thing is I happened on in an antique shop here in Maine, and that's a child's red sled. And that, of course, appears in the book, The Giver. The first time the boy sees color is, first of all, in an apple, but the color he sees is red. And then the second time he sees red is in the image he's having of a sled, and the sled reappears at the end of the book. Interestingly, the book Autumn Street that I mentioned also has a central plot point, for lack of a better phrase. A sled figures in that book as well. And now that's making me think of Citizen Kane.
Ah,
Maybe we're all connected in some bizarre way. But those are the two things that I have acquired, and I'm sure there are many others, but they seem to fit in here in this house because they're very old, and as are many things in this old house.
Lois, you've taken us on a whirlwind journey of decades of masterful writing, and the insights you have provided us leave us with so much to ponder. I know we're all looking forward to your more wonderful books, and I hope that many of our audience who has not read all of your previous books, which I have, will go back and read them, because they are certainly worth the your discussion will make them come so alive for people. And I, as one of the co-hosts of Authors Out Loud, Susan and I truly want to thank you for all of this. You have just opened our eyes and our minds to so many things.
Oh, and I thank you too. It's been such fun being with you.
Yes, cannot thank you enough. Thank you so much, Lois.
Thank you.